Shall I kick off? I think we're here. Let's go. Let's do this final hub. Hello, everyone. Wonderful to see you all. Congratulations on making it through the week. The first meeting of states parties to the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons has concluded. And it's been a big week of events in Vienna and in Australia. And tonight we're online only. Unfortunately, we had to cancel the Melbourne hub. COVID strikes again. My thoughts and prayers go out to anyone in this room with COVID at the moment. I hope you'll be okay. But I'll just firstly acknowledge that I'm on Dharawal land here in Wollongong, and the Dharawal elders have never given up this land. Sovereignty has never been ceded, and I pay my respects to their elders past and present. And I acknowledge all of the Aboriginal lands that you're joining from today. It's wonderful to see you. So thanks for all of you who've been with us this whole week. There might be a few people who have joined. Is there anyone who has joined, who watched on Sunday night? Put your hand up. Who watched on Monday night? Who watched on Tuesday night, on Wednesday night? So does that mean there are some people who have been with us for 4 nights this week? Because if so, you get a gold medal for being a top shelf treaty supporter. Thank you so much. So we've switched to an online program tonight, unfortunately, but Dimity will explain why Melbourne is a special place for the campaign.
Well, I think many of you will know this, of course, but Naarm, Melbourne, is, of course, the birthplace of ICAN. It was Naarm where we first discussed the ideas of ICAN, where our first funding came from, and where the first global launch was of the ICAN campaign in 2007, right here in Victoria's Parliament House. We maintain our national office in the Victorian Trades Hall here in Carlton. And although we all work from all around the country and online a lot, as well as with our friends around the world, for many of us, Melbourne is the base of ICAN Australia. We launched this campaign here on the lands of the Wurundjeri people. So we give our thanks and we pay our respects to the elders past and present of these beautiful lands. And we recognise again that sovereignty was never ceded.
So we have 2 special guests tonight with Jemila in Vienna before we then will move to the Melbourne section with our Melbourne guests. So we are going to Vienna for the first hour, and then from 7 p.m. Eastern time to 7:30, we'll move to our Melbourne section online. So it's a little strange, but it's the hybrid, post-hybrid world that we're in tonight. And so our first guest in Vienna is Muhadi Sugiono, who is well known to many of us in Australia. He's a lecturer at the Department of International Relations and a researcher at the Institute of International Studies, which is an ICAN partner in Indonesia at the University of Gadjah, Mada. And our most recent collaboration with Muhadi actually was our report on the submarine deal called Troubled Waters, Nuclear Submarines, AUKUS and the NPT. And Muhadi very kindly wrote a chapter for that, looking at Indonesian response and concerns with the proposed nuclear propelled submarines. And we will actually be revising and re-releasing that report in the next couple of months. And I'll just quickly also introduce our second guest in Vienna, who we will meet a little later, and that's Victor Chelashow. And Victor is a senior year medical student at Moi University in Kenya and the international student representative for the IPPNW, which is the International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War, students and advocacy co-lead at Youth for the TPNW. So he's a strong advocate for the treaty in Kenya and in Africa, championing its ratification and adoption. So we'll want to hear your questions for our guests tonight, and please do use the chat to introduce yourselves and to put your questions in. And then after these 2 guests, we will get the full lowdown from Jemila Rushton, our wonderful ICAN Australia anchor in Vienna, who's had a huge week. And she'll tell us about all the successes and the stresses and all of the little happenings on the side of the conferences this week in Vienna, before we then move to our Melbourne section. So just before we kick off, there are a couple of key documents from the end of the MSP that were released last night or early this morning. And that's the the declaration that was adopted. So the political statement adopted at the end of it by the states parties, and the action plan that the meeting came up with for moving this treaty forward. So please grab that from the chat and read that later. And I'm sure we'll hear about them from our guests. So it's Friday night here in Australia, but it is Friday morning there in Vienna, and our wonderful reporter Jemila is still sitting. You are still there after a really huge week. Congratulations. So tell us where you are today.
Good morning or good evening, everyone. Hi from Vienna. Just saying hi to Victor, who's just found our room. Come in, maybe grab a seat here and we'll do a chair swap in a minute. Yeah, so we're here at the Ruby Marie Hotel because the official proceedings of the meeting of states parties wrapped up yesterday afternoon for us in the evening. So we're not in the fancy UN building anymore, which you know, it's sad to leave that place behind for this sort of session. But yeah, so we're in a hotel where a lot of the ICAN staff team have been staying and just had a little bit of a breakfast and catch up. And yeah, there's a gallery space here that we're occupying at this point. So yeah, so we're still in Vienna. I think everyone's got quite high spirits. There was a rap event last night, which was really, really excellent, and people were very happy. And the mood has been, yeah, just the consistently high this whole week. I think just that the feeling of things happening and getting done, and Jem referred to the action plan, and there's so much stuff in there that will be really interesting to look over in more detail once the dust settles on the sort of frenetic energy of the meeting of states parties. But certainly the last day, we felt that it was, you know, the first few days were lots of very generous and great opening statements, which were so important to hear from everyone, you know, because it was this inaugural meeting. But certainly the feeling yesterday was a feeling of getting down to business and the serious work of implementing the treaty. So that was really sort of exciting to watch and hear people participate in conversation about that. So that's where we're at and how we're feeling, I think. So yeah, good to get started. But maybe I will just start by reintroducing Muhadi Sugiono, and yeah, he's joined us here in Vienna for the whole week, and is a lecturer at the Universitas Mada in Yogyakarta, and I'm also very happy because I'm an alumni of that university, so very, very happy to make that connection and yeah, have this chat with you here, Muhadi. So thank you for being with us. And now this first meeting of states parties to the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons is over, and this final declaration was given last night. What were your points of interest in this sort of Vienna declaration that was released by states parties?
Yeah, when I came to Vienna, I didn't have any big expectation of what we can get, simply because what came around 60 countries without the involvement of the nuclear weapon states and the big country in the treaty can do. But following the discussion in the whole process of the MSP, it changed my mind quite dramatically. And at the end of the meeting, I was so overwhelmed. I was so happy that the meeting have come up with a declaration, powerful one, as well as a strong message, which is far beyond my expectation. So as reflected in the declaration and the plan of action, it shows how the member of the state parties has a commitment to move forward with the implementation, reiterate its commitment to eliminate nuclear weapons, and so on and so on. it's, for me, indicate a very strong commitment of the state parties to be very serious with the Treaty of the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. And even more interesting is that they will keep on working until nuclear weapon is eliminated. So until all the countries in the world join the TPNW. That is quite powerful message. And beyond this declaration and plan of action, I observe also how the TPNW has become a new international standard for action by other states. For example, I took a note of statements by umbrella states, or I think, yeah, one of the umbrella state representatives said that, well, we are not state parties. We will not sign, we will not ratify, but what we have done comply with all that is mentioned in the TPNW. So this is a good sign that TPNW become the standard of reference for the countries, even outside the state parties, to refer when it comes to the action. It become the justification of what the action they can do. So having seen this development, I cannot have more optimistic than now that we have the state party come up with a very strong message and declaration, and I hope that a lot more countries will join, especially the participation of the non-state party also in the meeting was very positive indication that they are interested in. And even the fact that those countries who are not interested in joining the TPNW, but still they come to the meeting, it means that the TPNW cannot be ignored any longer. It is a real international norm that have to be taken into account by all countries, both state parties or non-state parties. That is my impression. And I am also very happy that there was a representative from Australia, Parliament came, and well done. And hope to see that Australia will be active participant in the next meeting as well.
Yeah, we were really pleased, and of course a lot of people in this Zoom room have worked hard over the years to build the political support in Australia for Australia to have this moment, this change of government, and to begin moving towards the treaty and engaging with the treaty. And I noticed that the other nuclear endorsing states that were there were some comments, they made some statements that were not exactly very helpful, and Australia did not make a statement, which I don't necessarily see as a bad thing, because we've just had a change of government and the Department of Foreign Affairs needs to go through a process of weasel transition mode, I call it, where they need to adjust their policy and their thinking on this, and perhaps they weren't ready to say something good. So it's better to not say something at all yet if it will be, you know, something unhelpful or something that takes us backwards from the commitments we already have. But I'm wondering about the discussion of universalization during the meeting, and if you can tell us about what was discussed there, and also I'm sure we'd love to know where Indonesia is at in the process for ratification. Sorry, that was
I think all the countries have the commitment to universalize this treaty, and all the countries have the commitment also to take part in this process of universalization. With the case of Indonesia, I have to say that the commitment is there, and even the delegation of Indonesia reiterated its commitment that Indonesia ratification is still an ongoing process. I have a close contact with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. We have communicated to each other so far, and I was convinced that the process at the executive side has taken place and soon finish with the process, and the next step would be with the parliament. And now we are moving the lobbying process with the parliamentary members. So this is what we have done. But the fact that Indonesia has also contributed to the papers on universalization with Australia and Costa Rica is indicate very clearly that Indonesia is on board. The ratification is only a matter of time. It is a matter of administrative process, but there should be no doubt that Indonesia will be part. And I was informed that this year we should have finished with the ratification.
That's wonderful, Muhadi. It's very exciting to hear. And of course, during the conference itself, we heard that 3 more states ratified during the conference. And at the end of the conference, we've heard that 8 more states have said that those ratification processes are in train in their countries, including, of course, your Indonesia itself. So that's a wonderful thing to see. It's wonderful to see.
I can add, I had a chance to have a discussion with some delegation. Those countries have signed the treaty, but hasn't started with the process of ratification. And I asked why. Yeah, we would like to see what happened here, and then we will start from there to see whether we need to ratify or not. This means that given the result of the MSP yesterday, I think it will convince those countries to move with ratification. And we can expect that in the next few months, or at least this year, there will be more and more countries become state parties.
That's fantastic. Muhadi, one of the other factors that we've heard a lot of this week is the voices of the affected communities, including in our region in the Pacific. And that's really brought home the power and the promise of the treaty, especially around Articles 6 and 7. What have you heard this week from affected communities and how they've influenced the discussions there?
Yeah, I think there have been much time discussed to deal with the assistance to the victim and rehabilitation of the lands and so on and so on. And it is very fantastic that the action plan also come up with very practical plans to deal with this issue. And I think this makes the treaty quite exception in comparison to the previous international nuclear regime. So we hope that this will be all inclusive. Not only it is about the nuclear weapons, but about the impact, really, because we know that we started with the humanitarian impact, with discussing the impact of nuclear weapons to the people. And now the fact that TPNW give attention to these affected communities, the survivors, the victim, then this is quite relevant for us. Everyone have to take a note on this.
Just one last question from the chat. Some NATO country member states, Sweden, Germany, and Netherlands, sent delegations as well. Do we have a sense of what they took home from the MSP?
I think they must have been disappointed in the sense that they, like me, in the initially when I came here, I was a bit pessimistic, and I think having seen the process during the 3 days, they would be very disappointed that they were in the wrong side of the history. That this is a very powerful movement to transform global politics toward more humanitarian world politics.
Wonderful. I mean, not wonderful that they're disappointed, but wonderful that it is those things. Congratulations and thank you so much. Are there any last questions from our guests, from our gathered few in the 64 people here? So is there any questions from the floor that anyone would like to ask Muhadi at this point? Any last ones? No? Okay, well, thank you very much, Muhadi. I hope you can stick around for a little longer to hear the rest of the Zoom, but I know you might be traveling. So it's wonderful to see you, and we look forward to much more with you in the coming months, and we'll see you perhaps in New York in November next year, right?
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks, Muhadi.
Okay, we'll do a little
Okay,
switch,
Victor,
yeah.
I switch to the side of Victor. Fantastic.
Thank you so much, Muhadi. It's been really great to spend time with you and hear your insights over the past few days. We've, had a really good relationship of being like, did you hear this? What did they say? So, and yeah, we've all really relied on each other in this last few days to stay on top of everything, because it really was moving at such pace. So yeah, really great to have the community around us. But maybe now we can pivot over to our next guest, Victor. Thank you for joining us. It's been wonderful to have you. For those who might have joined the call a bit later, this is our second guest, Victor Chelashow, and he's part of the International Positions for the Prevention of War, and also has been leading things up on youth for TPNW here in Vienna. So really great to have you. What have been the highlights of the week for you so far?
Thank you so much for having me. Really excited to see you. Yay. So for me, what really struck by me is there's a lot of support for the TPNW. Just like Muhadi said, initially I was a little bit apprehensive. I thought it was just countries in the global south that are going to be in the conference discussing these things, but also to see representatives and interest from the global north and also from NATO, basically, to be part of the conversation, and also to have a lot of youth from nuclear weapon states and umbrella states really pushing. For me, it shows that I'm not alone, because sometimes we feel like we are alone, but to see everyone means that it's really a global movement. And also hearing stories from affected communities really touched me. So I'm really feeling motivated to carry on. Just so you know, I'm from Kenya, and my country has not yet ratified the treaty. So another thing that I've learned from people, from advocates, from activists about ratification. So I'm really looking forward to that. Yeah.
Great. Did you have questions from the Zoom room?
Oh, I had some questions.
Yeah.
Victor, it's so lovely to meet you. We've talked online and I've heard so much of your work in the room there. So it's wonderful to meet you this way, at least. I hope we'll meet in person one day. I wanted to know, as a student of health and a leading member of student representation through IPPNW, what were the things, like you said, the affected communities was something that really impacted on you, but what are the things from the conferences, all of the conferences you've observed this week, that give you real hope for the success of the treaty?
Yeah, so like I said earlier, just to say the global movement, but more specifically, just to add on that, is that we've been having people from different generations. We've had young people, we've had like really old folks, and just show that there's intergenerational dialogue going on, and also people from various backgrounds. Coming from a health background, I've only sort of known to discuss nuclear weapons from a health perspective. Then to also meet people from international law, people who are doing film and theater, like from different backgrounds, it shows that like there's a multilateral approach to this, and what kind of inspires me, like gives me hope that everyone is really interested in this. And also, like I said earlier, to hear survivors who come to the conference and share the story, and I feel like that's the most important bit. Like hearing survival stories, because I think talking about nuclear weapons with people who are in power and just telling them about, how there's this paper, there's this research, they might not really get it. But when they hear one-on-one stories from survivors, I think that really pushes it. So yeah, for me that's it. Yeah. Yeah.
And we actually had a lot of in the sharing of stories between survivors, like the common thread around health impacts, and that like, oh, we are experiencing these same health impacts, or we are also experiencing this. And I think that sort of, I don't want to speak for people, but I've overheard so many conversations where there's been a huge validation, even though it's, horrific to think that there's these health impacts so far over the world from, nuclear weapons use and testing. But yeah, to have that opportunity to find common common ground around the health stuff. Yeah, I don't know if you've heard things like that, but certainly that's what I've overheard, and there's a power in that as well, because it's
absolutely. From school I learned about the biophysical effects of radiation, and it's just, for us mostly, it's just to learn and pass the exams, but then to see that it actually is real, that there are people who are suffering from these conditions, and it's not because of their choosing. I mean, it's not, they're not the ones who are testing. And for me, it really made an impact on me. And
yeah, that's so interesting, and I think that's a common thread through previous conferences and get-togethers, is that people have been really moved and motivated by the stories of impacted people. And I know from our First Nations ambassadors, impacted people from Australia, when they've travelled overseas to speak at the UN or to attend the negotiating conference, there's been a lot of value in connecting with other people with similar impacts, and I guess having that shared story. But I just want to come back to you, Victor. It's great that wonderful to meet you across the seas, and you're part of youth for the TPNW, and I'd love to know a little bit more about how the youth are operating and organising together around this issue, and also what opportunities you had during the events this week for the youth voice to be heard.
Thank you for that. So just like she said, I'm part of an organization called Youth for the TPNW. We started off 9 months ago. Yeah, we're really young, like 9 months, literally a baby. That's how I think of it. And
you've just been born.
Yeah, just been delivered. So initially, we've not had so much time to plan the events, but we just came together, youth from different parts of the globe, and so we organized some side events for the youth, because we believe that youth are not only the leaders of tomorrow, but we're also making change right now, and especially if we really want to keep this conversation going in the long term, so that maybe we also kind of, so that we can be the last generation maybe to discuss and to have nuclear weapons around. So that's our vision. That's our goal. And so what we did at the conference, we had 2 days of youth events. So we had youth from different parts of the globe, mainly activists and advocates, just sharing stories, telling what we had from affected communities. We have climate activists. It was really diverse in terms of background, but also in terms of experience. And so we just come together and try our best to support youth movements. And we also had some advocacy actions, most importantly. Yes, we had advocacy actions in front of the UN. We made posters that calls for, basically in line with what ICAN is doing with the city's appeal, with the parliamentary pledge, and what we want to do moving forward. We want the youth MSP to be part of the main event, not like a side event, but we want youth to be involved in the conference, or even if we can have like a pre-event for just specifically for the youth. That's what we want to do. But we're also right now supporting youth in different parts of the globe, and we're really glad that we have some more time to plan for next year. And definitely we're going to come in big. We're coming in strong, and we really received a lot of support from the president, Alexander Ment. We also from British Spain. Yeah, they were really supportive of us, and they were able even to join our event. So we really are picking steam, and we're going to keep this going. Yeah,
it's great to
very high around the youth participation. People really were like, wow, there's just so many young people here, and there's people here I don't know, and this is amazing. You know, like there was just so much of that over the last few days. So yeah, so great to hear that too.
Absolutely.
I didn't realize it was such a young movement. I'm even more impressed now.
Thank you. We also had youth speaking at the main event. We had Betty, we had some very impressionable youth from Japan speaking in the main conference, just carrying on with the message, that it's our time and we can do this,
And it's notable that it's in the final declaration as well, that youth are noted in the final declaration as a very distinct group of people that are a part of this. So that's wonderful. A question is from the chat is, how do we get those who are armed to the teeth to do the right thing for today's children and future generations? Big question. What do you think, Victor?
Pardon? Sorry, I did that.
Can you say the question, Angie?
How do we get those who are armed to the teeth, as in their nuclear weapons states, to do the right thing for today's children and future generations?
That's an interesting question. Sure. Yeah. So I think the TPNW, unlike the NPT, I feel gives a lot of power to non-nuclear weapon states. And I feel like, as a person who comes from a non-nuclear weapon state, I feel like if we have more and more countries sign, somehow we can get the 9 nuclear weapon states, we can corner them, and then we can bully them. Like we can just isolate them, we shame them. Yeah, so that they can be alone and they'll give up. But most importantly, I feel like we have a lot of movements in nuclear weapon states. Studies actually show that there's immense public support for the TPNW in nuclear weapon states. So I feel like if we give external pressure with the TPNW, but also give internal pressure from the countries, I feel like we can do this. So you can lobby with your governments, with your local governments, and for example, in Australia, which I really like to mention it as an example, we've had people come together, and especially I had women had a lot to do with this, to elect a new government that is kind of leaning more towards TPNW. So I feel there are things we can do. We can change our leaders. We can let them know how we feel. But from just outside, we can give like a bit more pressure with that. But I feel not so many people are really concerned with the issue of nuclear weapons in nuclear weapon states. So at the same time, public education, and also change people's perspectives, people's way of thinking and their views towards nuclear weapons will be really, really instrumental, especially in nuclear weapon states. At least that's what I think can work. Yeah. What do you think?
Yeah, I think it would be fantastic to develop a chapter of Youth for the TPNW in Australia. So if you have any advice for us on how to get that going, I definitely no longer qualify. But I think there are definitely young people who are interested in this. A lot of people are studying international relations or politics at university, and they get in touch with the campaign and they really want to be part of something. And yeah, I think that would be, so if there's any way to help that to kick off, please give us advice. But finally, I just wanted to hear from you about the next steps in your region, because I know there are a lot of signatories in Africa and signatories who have not yet become states parties. So what do you think is next for your region?
Yeah, so in my region, let me just start off with East Africa. That's where I'm from, and then maybe the wider context. So in Kenya and Uganda, Tanzania, Burundi, Rwanda, we have signed but not yet ratified. So we support, but then we also don't support. So it's a weird position to be in. But we are trying our best to get the treaty ratified. So in Kenya, for example, we've had meetings with all the relevant ministries, and they're actually for it. We're just hitting a barrier with the Ministry of Defense. But we're really hoping in the next 2 or 3 years, we're gonna get it ratified. And what I know for sure is that once one country, especially Kenya, we have some sort of influence in East Africa. Once we start ratifying, then you're gonna have a lot of countries joining in. You're gonna have a lot of countries also ratifying, and yeah, and that's the way to go. But it's really a lot of work still to go, because we don't want the focus to be just on African states ratifying the treaty, but we also need it to be a global, because it's a global treaty really. Yeah, so those are the next steps for us. We're just going to push for more ratification. We'll have a meeting for the African activists, like an ICAN Africa, who are interested in ratification efforts. And we had such a meeting here, one of the side events, and we discussed a lot. And so we just need a lot of support to carry on with our work, and we're learning from one another. So we're going to have more meetings to deliberate on the way forward, but also to kind of give the governments pressure, but also work with them. Yeah.
Fantastic. Well, I think I can say from all of us that all power to you, and thank you for your work and your efforts, and please keep at it. And we also promise to do everything we can to bring Australia on board the treaty as soon as possible. So thanks so much for joining our hub today.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
And safe travels home.
Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, it's weird to think that we will all not be in the same country after in a few hours. Everyone will be zooming off back to their their other places. So yeah, very special.
So now is the part where we get to ask you, Jemila, all sorts of questions, because you've had a really busy week. You've been really advocating to the Australian delegation, and I'm sure we're all so curious to hear your thoughts and your analysis of what has happened, if you've even had time to process it. But just anything you can share over the, maybe the final day. And then I'm sure our audience will have questions for you, and we'll go from there.
Okay, yeah, it is still very, there's a lot still percolating, I have to say. I haven't really even had much time to really look in detail at the action plan and the declaration, because it was all just so happening yesterday. But from what I saw in there, like, it is sort of, there's a lot of steps in the action plan. It's not just like a 3-point page, it's a multi-page document, and there's a lot in there around, states playing a really active role in talking to other states and working towards that sort of regional ratification, universalization within regions. So there's items in there around approaching other states in international forums, raising the TPNW in international forums, holding events in the home country that raise the profile of the TPNW. So there's many things in this action plan and around each article of the treaty. So I think, they've got a lot of homework to do. And another thing that was agreed to yesterday was a series of intercessional meetings, which will be opportunities for states alongside sort of civil societies to continue the work. So it isn't one of these sort of things that is like, see you in 2 years and we'll rehash the same thing, which I think has been a reputation that maybe, say, other meetings around nuclear disarmament have accumulated over the years, that kind of reputation of a big meeting where not much happens. So I think having these intercessionals lined up as well was a very positive sort of affirmative action of people continuing conversations and doing the work in between the meeting of states parties. And also exciting to see that, they've set a date for either November, we're looking at November, December next year in New York for the next meeting. So, it feels like this will be constant for states that are participating and having discussions, because in the context of things, it's not really that far away. So if you consider intercessional events and then the work that would go into leading into a meeting, it's sort of, we're going to keep people busy, and that feels really positive, because it feels like it's not going to be left to sort of idle, after such strong declarations and strong commitments to action from states here this week. So those are bits that I sort of have taken away from yesterday, feeling really positive about. And as I said at the start of the call, moving into that part of the meeting yesterday where people were sort of committing to things and discussing the detail and getting into it was incredibly exciting. And there was so much applause and people were so happy, standing ovation at the end of the meeting. And I was sort of saying, like, does this normally happen at the UN? And it doesn't, like, we've had so much, it's just been so positive. And I think that's, the role of civil society being so deeply embedded in this meeting, I think has a lot to do with that. Can take away, maybe just grounds the meeting in a bit more of a community and, sort of grassroots, but also, still very important, but in that sort of celebratory nature and getting down to business. And those are all really huge highlights for me yesterday. Just thinking, what else happened yesterday? We had the beautiful opportunity to speak on a Pacific-led panel yesterday, which was yeah, the Pacific Borough, which was, yeah, really wonderful. And I felt so privileged to be able to be invited to that event, you know, the extension of, yeah, like invitation from Pacific communities, really bringing Australia, you know, inviting us in and being in that, you know, recognised as part of the Pacific, especially when our sort of, you know, previous governments have done really a lot to sort of distance ourselves and, you know, damage some of that sort of those relationships from the top. So yeah, like we've been building together in community here, and so yeah, I felt very privileged to speak on that panel, and alongside some incredible activists from across the Pacific and Pacific diaspora. So just hearing all of their perspectives and their such clear articulation of what is needed for their communities, and lots of them are part of the Youth for TPNW as well, just very articulate, very determined, and very well connected. I was just so impressed with how people are networking. And again, like, you know, this isn't the end of the work. People are just beginning, and so many relationships between grassroots activists and civil society have been strengthened over this day as well, because some of us hadn't met before, some of us had met only frequently or by Zoom, and I think now we all have this yeah, shared experience to draw on and motivate each other, and the personal connections, so we know what we can call on people for. We've got ideas of what people's expertise are or their experience, and it just feels like that is so strengthening for this movement going forward, especially when we have been so isolated in our regions, and particularly in Australia. I think the campaign has been isolated, and we're slowly being surrounded by ratified states with, you know, another ratification from Timor-Leste, with one more of our embrace from our neighbours bringing us into this treaty. So yeah, those are probably some of the highlights for me. So yeah, it was an incredible day, and I think it's all really still settling in. And yeah, I think being able to launch there was many of you will have been at the Port Augusta hub or tuned into the Port Augusta hub earlier in the week, and there was an incredibly powerful statement that was released from community members, impacted communities, and all of those that attended in person in South Australia. And yeah, it was a great honour to sort of be able to table that in this side event and speak to some of the calls for action that came from impacted communities in our country, in our region, about what's needed, and their demands to be at the table in working out these solutions and really leading on these solutions. So yeah, and those were some of the ones where people were picking up the statement and reading it and being like, we have we have community and we have solidarity. And even if they hadn't attended the event, it was sort of like it was such a warm reception, and so important that we, you know, continue to create these spaces, I think, going forward. And I think there's lots of lessons that have come out of, you know, organising in a pandemic, I'm sure, for the organisers of the forums and all of the events this week around inclusivity, how to do these kind of hybrid events better, and hopefully all of that can feed into, you know, the MSP, the next MSP, and the events surrounding that for next time. And I think New York is an excellent choice, because so many more states have permanent missions or permanent sort of staff, ambassadorial staff based in New York. So that will, I think, encourage some greater participation, because unfortunately there were a few situations where people weren't able to access visas in time or go through the necessary processes to attend in Vienna. So I think New York will be another step towards that inclusivity, and hopefully the organising around events can continue to make sure that, you know, maybe people who are from impacted communities travelling with health conditions, or for whatever reason that limits people's participation in these big events with a lot of international travel, that we can continue to kind of break down those, you know, accessibility barriers and work on that inclusiveness. But yeah, I think it was a great event and a great start in really pushing that agenda and making efforts to bring people in. So Yeah, that's a few ramblings from me. I don't know if there are any other questions. But,
there's a lot of questions coming in, and you've made people go make all sorts of places. Yeah, they're very exciting questions. And look, it's just wonderful. A lot of comments here, and a lot of thoughts sparking my head too. But a lot of comments here saying, you know, thanks so much for describing the collaborative process that's underway there, because that's one of the things that being in the room can really do, you know, that sense of being able to sort of make those connections. So you described that beautifully there, and it really is quite an important thing to do. It was a big thing to go over, particularly in the middle of a pandemic, to make that kind of choice to be able to go there. And there were a lot of people who chose not to because of the risks, particularly from vulnerable people with vulnerable health conditions, or for elders, especially the Habakasha and test survivors and so forth. So, but it is always so gratifying to hear, you know, how it is to be in that room, you know, amongst good people. There's a few questions here around MSP. MSP, sorry people, is the meeting of states parties. This is the process that was put in place when the treaty came into force, was that there would be meetings of states parties as they are gathering, universalizing this treaty. That means getting more and more people signing and ratifying it. These meetings of states parties are there to start laying down the ideas of how this is going to run. And so the two great documents that came out of this first meeting of states parties, which is only 3 days, a lot of work was done in the preparation. But a lot of the documents that came out of that are the declaration that came out last night, and now this action plan, which Jemila was referring to as well. And so that's in answer to that. The statement from Port Augusta, I'm glad to hear that it was well received over there. And I think from watching this all closely from here, it seems to me that those calls that are made in that statement for better monitoring, for better research, for better healthcare and assistance for people who have been impacted, that seems to be quite universal over from affected communities over there. Am I right in that?
Yeah, absolutely. There's been so many calls for that, and so many. One of the other common threads around as well is around this sort of the need for self-identification of people to identify and be treated in structural terms, individual terms, in that survivor status and an impacted status, and not necessarily be let those determinations be made by the governments that either allowed testing or allowed have been responsible for delivering assistance to people who have been impacted by these weapons. So I think that was a very important one of people speaking up and saying, we know our history and we know the impact that it's having on our community, and we should be the ones determining obviously the solutions and the pathways, but determining their position in that, because I think so much of we've heard a lot of stories about, you've left the place, or you've but the part of the reason that people might have left is because of the environmental damage, or the economic conditions making it very difficult, and these are all inherited from the use and test and the complex situations that people face as a result of the testing and or the weapons use. So that was also a very strong that came through from a lot of people around that need for self-identification, and then the sort of need for resources to be made available for people to be able to describe and share their expertise of their lived experience. So that was another common thread that really came through from survivors here.
Thanks so much. There are a couple of questions that I want to come to. I've had one sent to me. Let me find it. It is about the intercessional meetings, and if it will be possible for non-states parties to attend those intercessional meetings.
I will have to look at the detail. That's part of it. Yeah, I think there will be participation, certainly. Yeah, but I'm not sure on the detail of just how that is going to be, how that will look. But yeah, certainly there was a very big push for it to not just be states parties, and certainly for there to be like civil society partners in some of these intercessional meetings, particularly so that we can, as I was saying before, keep creating spaces for people from impacted communities and those who work closely with them to participate, you know, rather than continue, so trying to sort of dismantle some of those really huge hierarchies that exist in still exist between governments and civil society.
Okay, well, we'll find out. It would be good if there are these markers along the way that we can, for example, advocate for Australia to be part of, so that they just move more and more towards becoming part of the TPNW community. And of course, we want to see them signed up before the next meeting of states parties. We'll take a break in a few minutes. There's another question here from John saying, how much do the numbers matter if the big players are not present? Which is, there's an interesting frame around that question, but interested to hear your thoughts on that.
The numbers of
states parties and countries that are present.
Okay, yeah, well, I think Muhadi touched on this a little bit before with the sort of norm setting that we're seeing with the TPNW, that it is becoming this like international standard, and like some of the states that we're observing made reference in their statements, in their sort of general exchange of views, that they see the value of different articles within the TPNW, so I think it is just becoming the sort of expectation and the norm, and it does become for us, you know, in Australia and elsewhere where there is, you know, not yet the formal commitment or the signature to push on these sort of elements of the treaty where there is room to create dialogue in our countries around some of these articles and some of the needs of the treaties. And I was talking with Janine Yazzie yesterday, who is a Diné activist, and she was sort of saying, well, yeah, this is how we have organised in the USA, in Turtle Island, around the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. So that the USA didn't join that till very late, but that became the benchmark, and that became the sort of standard of where people's expectations were about being at the table and participation, and what governments should be committing to. So I think that, and this has sort of been seen in other treaties as well, so around other weapons, cluster munitions and landmines, where that it does become the norm setting, and even if states have not quite fully come on board or signed on the dotted line, they have begun to comply or implement things that are central to the treaty. So I think that, we will, we hope that we'll start to see some of this from states that have not yet joined, and hope that this will just grow more and more as the TPNW grows more prominent and the action plan is kind of rolled out and attended to by the states parties.
Yeah, that's great. And one of the things that Alexander Clement, who was the president of this conference, made really clear was that there was a real openness in the TPNW process, and that became really evident over this time. And he talked about, you know, that for many states who previously came with a bit of antagonism towards the TPNW, that has sort of fallen away in this process so far. That a lot of that sort of binary kind of argument, you know, bipolar almost, back to the Cold War kind of politic, has sort of lessened just in this week of these amazing conferences, these historic conferences. He talked a lot about the energy and the urgency and the sense of responsibility. And I think you see that in that final declaration, where we have, you know, its title is Our Commitment to a World Free from Nuclear Weapons. It's very powerful language. I really recommend people pick it up and have a read of it. So thank you, Jemila, for that. Jem, was there any last questions there? No. So because we have not been able to hold our in-person hub in Naarm, we thought we'd take a moment now to give you all a bit of a rest and a stretch before we turn to the second part of our online hub. While doing that, we wanted to share with you a video that has been done by poet from the Marshall Islands, Kathy Jetnall-Kijner. It's a very powerful one. It's a very short one. So just thought you could stretch your legs, grab a cup of tea if you're going to stay on with us. And after that, we'll be turning back to our next guests, who are Monique and Nic, and we will continue our conversations as well. Jem, did you have anything to add? No? Are you able to post the video? And everyone's most welcome to stay online with us. We won't be very long. It's a short video. And then we should be able to go straight into our next conversation as well.
I'm coming to meet you. I'm coming to see you. What stories will I find? Will I find an island or a tomb? To get to this tomb, take a canoe. Take a canoe through miles of scattered sun. Swallow endless, swirling sea. Gulp down radioactive lagoon. Do not bring flowers or speeches. There will be no white stones to scatter along this grave. There will be no songs to sing. How shall we remember you? You were a whole island once. You were breadfruit trees, heavy with green globes of fruit, whispering promises of massive canoes. Crabs dusted with white sand scuttled through pandanus roots. Beneath looming coconut trees, beds of watermelons slept still, swollen with juice. And you were protected by powerful Iroij chiefs birthed from women who could swim pregnant for miles beneath a full moon. Then you became testing ground. 9 nuclear weapons consumed you one by one by one, engulfed in an inferno of blazing heat. You became crater, an empty belly. Plutonium ground into a concrete slurry filled your hollow caverns. You became tomb. You became concrete shell. You became solidified history. Immovable, unforgettable. You were a whole island once. Who remembers you beyond your death? Who would have us forget that you were once green globes of fruit, pandanus roots, and whispers of canoes? Who knows the stories of the life you led before? Here is a story of a turtle goddess. She gifted one of her sons, Ledao, a piece of her shell anointed with power. A leathery green fragment, hollow as a piece of bark. It gave Ledao the power to transform into anything, into houses and trees, the shapes of other men, even kindling for the first fire. He almost burned us alive. I am looking for more stories. I look and I look. There must be more to this than incinerated trees, a cracked dome, a rising sea, a leaking nuclear waste with no fence. There must be more to this than a concrete shell that houses death. Here's the story of another shell, anointed with power. Ledao used it to transform into kindling for the first fire. He gave this fire to a small boy. The boy almost burned his entire village to the ground. Licks of fire leapt from skin and bones, from strands of coconut leaves. While the boy cried, Ledao laughed and laughed. This is a story of a people on fire. We pretend it is not burning all of us. Here is a story of the ways we've been tricked, the lies we've been fed. It's not poisonous anymore. Your illnesses are normal. You're fine. You're fine. My belly is a crater empty of stories and answers. Only questions. Hard as concrete. Who gave them this power? Who anointed them with the power to burn?
Well, thank you very much, everyone, for joining us or staying on with us for the second part of our hub tonight. The part that would have been in person, that would have had all this food at the pub, that would have been really fun to be together and eating together. But it's wonderful that we could all be together at least this way as well. We're going to say goodbye to Muhadi and to Victor as well. And a big thank you to you both for joining us. We've been really appreciating it so much. And thank you. Bye.
Thank you. And let's move into the Melbourne section now. Just take a minute to adjust after that video. It's such a powerful one, and we were so lucky to be approached by Kathy and the filmmaker Dan Lin, and ICAN released that video back in 2018. So it's there to watch again. It's a beautiful resource. But now I'd like to invite our next guest, Monique Cormier, who is a senior lecturer at Monash University Faculty of Law. And she's recently returned to Melbourne, and we were looking forward to seeing her in person, but alas, we're grateful that she could join us online. So Monique's research primarily includes jurisdiction and immunities in international law and legal issues relating to nuclear non-proliferation. So that makes sense that she has an interest in this treaty. She has been researching and speaking about the TPNW for many years, including a paper co-authored with Anna Hood titled "Can Australia Join the Nuclear Ban Treaty Without Undermining ANZUS?" And I've also heard Monique speak beautifully on a podcast about this issue as well. So are you there, Monique?
Yes, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Wonderful. Good to have you here, and please talk to us about your work.
Sure. So thanks so much for having me this evening. It's really great to be part of these nuclear ban hubs. And so, look, as Jem has just said, my interest in nuclear issues is from the perspective of an international lawyer, and in particular, my research focus has been on Australia's compliance or non-compliance with nuclear non-proliferation obligations. And so what I thought I would talk to you about in my just short presentation today is some of the existing obstacles to Australia ratifying the TPNW. And I suppose in one sense they are legal obstacles to the extent that there are some provisions in the treaty that might prove problematic for Australia at the moment. But in reality, these obstacles are largely political. So the crux of the TPNW is obviously to ban states from really having anything to do with nuclear weapons. And I know a lot of you are intimately familiar with the TPNW, but perhaps for those who are not, Article 1 sets out a pretty comprehensive list of prohibited nuclear weapons related activities requiring states parties never to, under any circumstances, to develop, test, produce, manufacture, otherwise acquire, possess or stockpile nuclear weapons or other nuclear explosive devices. And I would hope that this provision is never going to be an issue for Australia. Successive governments have always said that Australia has no plans to acquire nuclear weapons. There are also some sub-provisions in Article 1 that prohibit transfer of nuclear weapons, receiving nuclear weapons, and of course threatening to use nuclear weapons. Where there are potentially a couple of issues for Australia is Article 1, subsection E, which says states parties are prohibited from assisting, encouraging or inducing in any way anyone to engage in any activity prohibited to a state party under this treaty. And so I refer to this as the complicity provision. States parties cannot be complicit in any prohibited activity, even if it's not doing such activity itself. And the way that Australia is, likely to run into problems with this is due to its security relationship with the US. So as one of the main nuclear weapons states, the US itself is clearly doing a lot of these activities that the TPNW has banned. At a bare minimum, it stockpiles and possesses nuclear weapons. I believe it's also still developing, producing, manufacturing, those sorts of things. And Australia is obviously not directly involved in such prohibited activity undertaken by the US, but there are two potential avenues through which Australia could nevertheless fall afoul of the complicity provision in the TPNW. The first is by virtue of its policy of extended nuclear deterrence, and the second is because of the fact that Australia hosts the US-Australia Joint Defence Facility known as Pine Gap in Alice Springs, which plays a role in supporting potential US nuclear activities. So I'll briefly just talk about what each of these are and then how they might be a potential roadblock for Australia to join the TPNW. So extended nuclear deterrence, it's essentially a nuclear protection agreement under which a state with nuclear weapons will use or threaten to use nuclear weapons in defense of a non-nuclear ally. The idea, of course, behind extended nuclear deterrence is that potential enemy attacks on the non-nuclear state will be deterred by credible threats that nuclear weapons will be used. And Australia's relied on US nuclear protection as a key component of its international security policy for decades. And so coming back to the complicity provision of the TPNW, states parties are prohibited from encouraging any banned activities. And so the term encourage is generally understood sort of to mean to allow or promote continuance or development of something. And so in the context of the TPNW, extended nuclear deterrence arguably promotes, at the very least, the continuance of nuclear weapons possession and stockpiling, both of which are prohibited by the treaty. And then in addition, the preamble, of course, to the ban treaty specifically expresses concern about continued reliance on nuclear weapons in military and security concepts, doctrines and policies, which lends further support to interpreting the prohibition on encouraging as a prohibition on extended nuclear deterrence. And of course, given the whole object of the TPNW is to completely eliminate nuclear weapons, guarantee that they're never to be used ever again in any circumstances, there really isn't any scope to argue that extended nuclear deterrence is compatible with the TPNW. And that's the first nuclear weapons related activity that Australia would need to get rid of in order to be able to join the nuclear ban treaty. The second one's a little bit more complicated because the activities at Pine Gap are highly classified, highly technical. I'm not even close to being an expert on what happens at Pine Gap. And for my research, I've always relied on ICAN's Richard Tanter's, his Pine Gap analysis. So all I'll say here is that Pine Gap's principal function is surveillance, and through various Pine Gap systems, surveillance data is collected that plays a role in monitoring global nuclear weapons activity. And that data would also play an essential role in the planning of any nuclear weapon deployment by the US. So if they detected an enemy nuclear missile launch, they could also tell which of those enemy's missile silos are still capable of firing and therefore could be a target for retaliation nuclear strikes. So in a nutshell, these jointly operated systems at Pine Gap collect and process data that can be used by the US for nuclear war planning purposes. So I think there is an argument to be made that the ban in the TPNW's complicity provision on assisting any prohibited activities would potentially include such activities at Pine Gap, because the way that the term assist is interpreted under international law, it's broad, but it's not completely unlimited. So it's not, for example, a problem under the TPNW for a state to be in a military alliance with a nuclear armed state. So to that end, signals collections and analysis activities that happen at Pine Gap would be unlikely to amount to assistance for the purposes of the ban treaty, to the extent that they are used for early warning systems and just monitoring nuclear weapons. But the problem is these same systems can be used for nuclear weapons targeting, which could very well, which the targeting does definitely amount to prohibited activity under the TPNW. And the question would be whether Australia would be liable for assisting such banned activities. And that kind of depends on some more complex questions of international law relating to state responsibility. But so we have these two potential obstacles to Australia joining the TPNW, extended nuclear deterrence, Pine Gap activities. So if Australia was to join right now without any modification of its security policy and Pine Gap activities, it would at a minimum be in breach of the treaty for encouraging the US to possess nuclear weapons and quite possibly for assisting the US to potentially use them. So if Australia is serious in wanting to join the TPNW, we've seen that the Labor Party is a lot more amenable to that than the coalition was. It will really need to start seriously thinking about winding back some of the nuclear aspects of its relationship with the US. And look, it's probably easier said than done, but it's not impossible. So, obviously nuclear deterrence is so exceedingly dangerous. And part of me hopes that seeing Vladimir Putin openly threatened to use nuclear weapons recently in Ukraine has actually reminded world leaders that this isn't some academic exercise. The existence of nuclear weapons is obviously an existential threat that has to be taken seriously. But so Labor's been traditionally a lot more in favour of the TPNW, but both Penny Wong and Richard Marles, so our new foreign affairs and defence ministers, have for quite a long time, even in opposition, been concerned about maintaining our strategic alliance with the US, perhaps as a priority over and above nuclear disarmament and prohibition. But look, I'm hopeful, given the new attitude and enthusiasm of the Labor government, given Joe Biden's genuine concern about nuclear proliferation, hopefully the time is right to now consider aspects of our strategic relationship with the US in order to make it possible for Australia to join the TPNW.
Thanks, Monique. That's a wonderful summary of a huge issue, a huge bunch of issues, actually. There's a couple of questions for you from the chat. One is, how does the lie that nuclear weapons make us safer stand up in the court of law?
Unfortunately, it's sort of been brushed aside by the International Court of Justice when they kind of looked into this, whether this is actually legal or not. They really didn't come down very firmly on this aspect. And I think law tends to leave these questions to the politicians. So unfortunately, that's where we're at with that one.
Well, on that, what did you think about Australia sending an observer to the TPNW?
I thought that was really, really positive sign that they're going to take this seriously. And I'm hoping that they'll move forward with the possibility of actually untangling Australia from anything nuclear to do with the US and going forward with the TPNW. So fingers crossed. I mean, I think already this has put Australia back in a better position in relation to the NPT. I was thinking, really Australia's its attitude towards the TPNW was so obstinate that I actually think it was having problems with its obligations under the NPT because it was like that. So I think this is actually a really good sign.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I think we might have to leave it there. It's been absolutely wonderful to have you as part of this, Monique, and it would be lovely to have longer conversations. I wish we were all in person here in Nam tonight. But thank you so much for your insights, and we look forward to talking a lot more with you as we approach the NPT, which is actually taking place next month. No, August. I can't keep up with my months. It's taking place in August, the review conference that has been long delayed. So the NPT, of course, for those who don't know, is the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which we are also a party to here in Australia, and most countries in the world are party to the NPT. So thank you again, Monique, very much, and we will talk to you again soon. And now I would like to say that our next guest from the NAM hub that is now online is our friend Nic Maclellan. He's a Pacific journalist, former ICAN Australia board member, a writer and a long-time advocate for a nuclear-free and independent Pacific. Nic is a prolific reporter, including in the Islands Business magazine, but he's also the author of several books, including his 2017 book, Grappling with the Bomb, which tells the history of Britain's Pacific nuclear bomb tests, and in particular highlights the impact on Fijian military personnel, something very dear to my heart, who were used in the experiments in Kiribati in the late 1950s. Nic, welcome to the Hub. We hope you're feeling well. And what have you been observing over this last remarkable week at the Vienna conferences, particularly around the Pacific voices?
Dimity, thank you. And thank you to the organisers for inviting me. I speak to you from the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. It's really striking. As you mentioned, my book, Grappling with the Bomb, talks about the nuclear legacies in Kiribati, where Britain tested 9 atomic and hydrogen bombs in the 1950s. And it was symbolic that the ambassador to the United Nations for Kiribati, Ambassador Teodoro Sito, led the work over the last year, together with his counterpart from Kazakhstan, to do a lot of work around consultations on Articles 6 and 7. These are the articles, really unique and important articles in the treaty about assistance to nuclear survivors, about environmental remediation for nuclear test sites, and about the responsibility of the nuclear weapon states to assist in these processes. And so Ambassador Sito was involved in a very concrete way, but that's no surprise. When the treaty entered into force in January last year, 10 of the 50 countries that first ratified it came from the Pacific, Aotearoa New Zealand, our neighbours across the Tasman, and 9 members of the Pacific Islands Forum. That's because our region was central to the development of nuclear weapons by the Western powers, with 50 years of nuclear testing across 10 sites in the deserts of Australia, in the land and waters of our neighbouring Pacific countries. And I'm amused too, because Ambassador Sito, a former president of Kiribati, a very respectable fella, but in his youth, he was a troublemaker. He was president of the University of South Pacific Students Association in the 1970s, and was a key activist in the nuclear free and independent Pacific movement at that time. And as Jemila and Victor and others told us today, that intergenerational mobilization that was such an important part of the meeting in Vienna is symbolized by the Pacific involvement, alongside leaders like Prime Minister Vorengi Bainimarama of Fiji, Ambassador Sito and other leaders, New Zealand's Disarmament Minister Phil Twyford. There was a big delegation of Pacific Church, civil society, women's groups and others. And as has been mentioned already, Bidi Rakul, Mary Tuilau, Danity Laukon, a whole range of young women from the Pacific spoke both in the side events but in the main sessions to talk about the humanitarian impacts and the intergenerational impacts. And I think that's really at the heart of TPNW, the recognition in the disarmament treaty, not just its focus on nuclear abolition, but also about the humanitarian impacts. And I think that's one of the things that Pacific communities have brought to the table, that lived experience of more than 310 nuclear tests across the region. But just as there are intergenerational effects in terms of the health, in terms of the environment, so there's an intergenerational history of resistance to nuclear testing. And I think that multi-generational participation that Victor talked about is so important, because a new generation has stepped up in the Pacific Islands to take up this issue. I was in Suva, Fiji in March this year for my work, and at the University of the South Pacific, the main regional university, on the 1st of March, there was a rally organised by Marshall Islands Students Association at the university. March the 1st, you'll know, is the anniversary of the Bravo nuclear test, the 1954 hydrogen bomb test on Bikini Atoll, conducted by the US, that famously or infamously irradiated the Lucky Dragon fishing boat from Japan, the people of the Marshall Islands, and indeed mobilized global attention on the threat of thermonuclear weapons. It sparked the Godzilla movies, the poetry of Honi Tufare, a Maori poet who wrote No Ordinary Sun. It sparked the Genswikyo movement, the movement against ANH bombs in Japan. It was a turning point in global mobilization. And at that time, the Pacific lived under colonial administration, but today, independent Pacific countries, I would say, are at the forefront of this movement. And we've seen that through Kiribati's role, which will continue addressing the Article 6, Article 7 obligations that the treaty brings forward. I think it's striking too that tonight we showed the little film Anointed with Kathy Jetnell-Kitchener. Kathy is involved in the Marshall Islands in a working group to update Marshall Islands National Action Plan on climate change, major challenge for the Pacific. And they are integrating their concern about nuclear contaminants from the Runit Dome that you saw in the film, the danger that radioactive isotopes from the era of nuclear testing buried in the 1970s on Enewetak Atoll are leaching into the marine environment in an era of sea level rise. And the Marshall Islands will have a climate action plan that includes nuclear issues. I think it's unique, but is a challenge before us. And I think that connection of issues is an important part that the Pacific brings to the discussion around TPNW. We saw it in the speech of Prime Minister Bainimarama of Fiji. He said, and I quote, "The 9 nuclear weapon states are projected to spend more than $100 billion every year to maintain their nuclear arsenals. Need I remind everyone that it's the sum of finance that developed countries pledged, but then failed to deliver to climate vulnerable nations by 2020. So the Prime Minister of Fiji, who will host next month's Pacific Island Forum Leaders Meeting as the current chair of the forum, is making that connection that there are broader security threats, the existential threat of climate change for many of our neighbouring Pacific countries that can't be addressed by the nuclear arsenals of the world. And I think one of the voices that the Pacific brings to this discussion is to refocus the debate on what are the threats to people's security that can't be addressed by nuclear deterrence. And the response when Russia began rattling its sabers earlier in the year was not, how do we develop nuclear weapons, but let's get rid of them. Well, it's also saying, Bainimarama's a rear admiral, former Navy man, commander of the military force, indeed, a coup leader in Fiji, but he has a personal connection. His father, Ratunoki Bainimarama, led the first contingent of Fijian sailors who travelled to Christmas Island in 1957 to witness the British nuclear tests for which Britain has never apologised, never granted recognition, never granted compensation. So though testing ended a quarter of a century ago in the Pacific, the environmental legacies are there, the health legacies are there for nuclear survivors, for the civilian and military personnel who staff the tests, but the resistance is there. 10 countries, more than half the membership of the Pacific Islands Forum, have already ratified. Other countries are on the path to do so. Pleasing to see Australia has taken that first step towards supporting that process that's very much part of the regional mood towards nuclear abolition, I think there'll be some questions for Anthony Albanese when he comes to Suva next month about how soon and how fast Australia will move to address the existential threats that both climate change and nuclear weapons create for the whole of humanity.
Brilliant, Nic. That is such a powerful summary of the importance of what we've seen over this week as well. There's a question here, I think it's from Jemila over in Vienna. Jemila, of course, having spent such a powerful week, as you said, and as we heard earlier, with all of those amazing Pacific Island delegation that was there. Jemila, did you want to ask your question directly to Nic?
Yes, I will, because I also typed it terribly in a rush, so don't read the chat. So Nic, we did hear a lot about these intersections that you briefly touched on around climate, militarism, nuclear history, and how they're all very real and potent topics for people across the Pacific in this moment. And yeah, definitely the Fijian Prime Minister's address was very powerful to a lot in the room, and I know that his conversations with the Australian delegation also were impactful in that way as well, in drawing those threads together. But yeah, what do you think this means, in going forward for the new government and Australia's relationship with the Pacific, given all the things that you've just mentioned?
I think the new government will be warmly welcomed in Suva. The fact that Prime Minister Albanese is not Prime Minister Morrison will hold him in good stead. The fact that Australia has increased its ambition on reduction of emissions, not to the level that the science requires, not to the level that most people in the Pacific want, but certainly it's a step in the right direction. I think Australia's presence in Vienna will be recognised as a step in the right direction, but the hard questions will remain. And I think after the initial honeymoon is over, those questions will be put to our leaders. The fact that the new ALP government supports the AUKUS partnership and is still talking about purchasing nuclear submarines raises concerns in the islands, because at a time of incredible geopolitical tensions, particularly between the United States and China, most Pacific Island countries have said that they want to be friends to all, enemies to none. Australia, through AUKUS, is saying, well, we want to be friends to one and enemies to another. So I think while there'll be a warm welcome in July, I think these long-standing challenges remain, and people don't want words, they want action. People in the Pacific have been talking about disarmament for many years. People have been calling for cleanup, recognition, compensation for nuclear survivors for many years. And they'll be looking for action, not just sweet words.
Beautiful way to sum up there, Nic. And I think there is a feeling of optimism and fierceness and determination in the air as well. So I think we will need to wrap this section up. Unfortunately, it is almost time for us to close up, but thank you again so much for your vigilance and your attention and your journalism to this issue over so many years. I know many of us rely on your insights and analysis, and we'll look forward to hearing after the Pacific Islands Forum, what your views are. And Dimity's holding up your excellent book, Grappling with the Bomb, which should be available at any good bookstore or online. So we'd encourage the listeners here to read that book, because it's a really thorough account.
Can I even say you can download it for free from ANU Press? Take away my royalties. It's available as a resource for people to use. So please check it out.
Very generous of you. And that is the important thing, that we read and learn these stories, because that is the backdrop to all of this work. So thank you, Nic. And I'll just do a little sum up before Dimity and I, my wonderful co-host for these hubs this week, before we close up. We've heard from friends and experts in Vienna from the United States, the Marshall Islands, Fiji, Japan, Kenya, Indonesia. And we've been really privileged also to listen deeply and to help bring to the stage in Vienna the stories of communities in South Australia who we met in Port Augusta last Sunday, who are continuing to face the legacies of nuclear weapons testing in this region. And also to then listen to our friends in Peace Boat to hear the testimonies of the Hibakusha, the atomic bomb survivors in Japan, and to draw those threads together. Of course, there's much hope for what this treaty can do for survivors and intergenerational descendants of survivors of nuclear testing in Australia over the years to come. And we're grateful to all of you who've joined these online sessions to connect us to these historic events unfolding in Vienna this week. It was so exciting to hear the closing address of Alexander Clement last night, and for him to say, we need to take care of this young and precious treaty and to move forward in the spirit of collaboration that has been present at this meeting, and to show the world what we can do. So, all bets are off. I think it's up to us to continue to make history. We're also really grateful, Jemila, our amazing representative in Vienna, who's been hosting these events with us and taking part in I don't know how many talks and events, and also chasing the Australian delegation and making sure that Susan Templeman MP was meeting all the right people and having all the conversations that she will take home back to the Prime Minister, and will hopefully be able to catch up with her at home as well and move things along for signature and ratification. Also, I'm sure there are people on this call who've been part of the in-person hubs in Fremantle and in Meanjin and Brisbane, so including from MAPW, the Medical Association for Prevention of War, Conservation Council of Western Australia, Mayors for Peace, and the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, WILF. Also thanking our friends at ICAN in Geneva, who helped fund some of the hub activities and broadcast the Port Augusta hub to the world. The team in Austria have done a really amazing job to organise these events, the Civil Society Forum, reporting every day on MSP TV, and so many people have been giving their perspectives on the meetings and delivering really important statements and coordinating civil society. It's been a really incredible global effort. If you haven't seen it yet, we also have a blog called Sacher Tort. I'm sure I said that wrong, and I'll rely on Tillman to correct me. But it's a famous Viennese cake, and in the campaign news section of our website, we have daily updates there. There are a couple more to be uploaded. Please have patience with that. And I will, towards the end, I'll put in a 2-minute video in the chat, which is a really good takeaway chunk of a speech of Anthony Albanese when he moved the resolution that commits Labor to signing and ratifying the treaty. And it's just really important to remember those words and to take that forward as we continue our work with this new government.
And while the pandemic still rages here and overseas, this effort to bring Australian voices to Vienna with love, as we said, and to keep us all connected with the proceedings here from this great distance is a real tribute to so many people who responded with a big yes when we first came up with this crazy idea. 4 hubs over a week, it's been quite something, and over 4 states, and of course Vienna. On behalf of the ICAN Australia board, I also wanted to acknowledge and thank our incredible staff team, Romuld and Jemila Rushton, and even though he technically belongs to the bigger world of ICAN, our Tim Wright as well. We have always known how incredibly lucky we are to have such a stellar, dedicated and capable people working with us. But this week again proves beyond a doubt that we are amongst the luckiest campaigns in the world. Your work has been incredible, Jemila and Tim, and I and the rest of the board and our partners cannot thank you enough. It's been a genuine joy to share this historic week with you all. And Ray Atchison said this week, in a world where dialogue and cooperation is nearly non-existent among so-called powerful states, it is up to us to shape our shared future. So civil society, and especially those with the lived experience of nuclear harms, affected community members and First Nations people in particular, are indeed lighting a path and providing a ray of hope in the work to rid the world of nuclear weapons. On that, as we said earlier, there's that important statement that came out of the Port Augusta hub this week from impacted communities, We'd really love you to read it. We'd love you to share it on social media, share it with your friends, with your family, with any of your groups that you're a part of. This statement is from people who are impacted by the nuclear weapons tests here in Australia, and it carries a powerful and defiant message that our stories and hopes are stronger than your weapons and fears. We know that has been heard all around the world now. And lastly, what would an event be in a civil society world without me shaking the tin? So please make a donation to support these events and our work in Vienna via our MSP appeal, which we've got going at the moment. We're crawling ever closer to our fundraising goal, and we'd really appreciate a donation of any amount. Thank you so much to all of those who've already contributed. Finally, again, just two last reminders. During the first meeting of the States Party, we saw 3 new countries ratify the TPNW, Cabo Verde and Grenada and Timor-Leste. That brings the TPNW states to 65 now. And 8 other countries announced that they would be ratifying the TPNW. So Australia really has to step up now. We're being left behind in this global pushback against nuclear weapons. And last of all, of course, grab your diaries because it's been confirmed. Mexico will be the president of the second meeting of states parties, which will be held from the 27th of November to the 1st of December, 2023. That's next year, people, at the UN headquarters in New York. We will plan to be there, but we'll also plan to bring you these kinds of events again in every possible way to ensure that Australian voices and views are heard around the world. Thank you so much to everyone. There's been beautiful messages in the chat, which I'm still catching up on, but thank you very much for tonight. Jemila, any last words?
Let's get Australia on board. Let's get it done.
Yeah, let's take a moment to celebrate and then get back to work.
Yeah, that's it.
Excellent.
Yeah, thanks everyone for tuning in. It's been really precious to bring so many great voices to Australia over the past week. So yeah, looking forward to seeing you all soon back home.
All right. Thank you, everybody. Go and enjoy your Friday night. Take good care of each other. Rest up. Don't get COVID, those who haven't got it already.